and I see that there are still people coming and joining us. Maybe that's also interesting for us, who is with us. Before we go for the inputs and the discussions and the small panel, it would be really interesting for us to see who is here. And for that, we prepared a small poll, 2 questions, and they will be shared in a second, and would ask you to answer, to let us know a bit on your level of experience with European Solidarity Corps and Erasmus Plus, organizing this webinar. And what is your background, your professional background? What is the role that you consider yourself taking part in this webinar? What is the... And I can see that it's already started. There's quite some people at the moment who have a lot of experience in European Solidarity Corps and Erasmus Plus, but also some who are not connected to the programs, which is also very okay. And if I look at the background, quite some project managers, coordinators, officers, some volunteers, youth workers, and some researchers in the audience altogether. So at the moment, most of us would consider themselves as being a volunteer, which fits perfectly to the topic we're discussing today and the role of young people and the importance of participation. So maybe this is already a good moment to ask for contributions. So whenever you have a question or a comment, please feel free to use the chat, and we'll also put a link for a Mentimeter in the chat that you can use and to comment, to ask, to react to the topics and the discussions we're going to have. So thanks for that. So a mixed group, a big variety of people listening and contributing today. And maybe to round up the introducing moment, as you can already see next to my screen, there is a tablet shown that is moving around all the time. And this is Agnes' tablet. She is facilitating the visual process of today. She will be spotlighted all the webinar long, so you can always have a look at what is happening in a visual way, maybe to reconnect and to see the pictures and the development of this webinar. So thanks, Agne, for joining us and for doing this great visual work. We are going to have 4 fantastic guests today. We plan to have 2 small inputs, first from the research side and then from the side of young people. And we will round up with a panel discussion with all 4 of our guests. And again, the invitation is to ask questions there and to contribute. And you're also invited to contribute to a small creative exercise. We would invite you to think of an association. What is volunteering? What is participation to you? And maybe connect it to an icon that is shown on the tablet right now. If you think on volunteering, does it connect maybe to a train? Why? Or does it connect to a bouquet of flowers because it's so diverse and colorful and smelling in different ways? So if you feel like there's a nice association you can find, please feel free to share in the chat. What is volunteering? Participation? How would you find a connection to one of the other icons? I will also put the icons in the chat so you can have a look at it later. And if you find during the discussions a nice connection, please feel free to show it to us, to share it. And here you go in the chat. Well, let's start first of all with our two invitees from the European Parliament. I would ask you to come on our virtual stage with me and present yourself very quickly. Who are you? What is your role? And maybe if you have, share an association with us. So I would warmly welcome Sofia Afanasieva, the representative of the Youth Outreach Unit of the European Parliament, and also João Albuquerque, as a member of the European Parliament. We are very happy to have you with us today. And I would invite you, maybe Sophia, as you're already with us, to quickly say who you are and present yourself.
Hi, thank you for having me and thank you for introducing a bit. So my name is Sophia. As has been said, I work for the European Parliament and I am part of the Youth Outreach Unit. We are the team which works on the outreach to young people within the Director General for Communications of the Parliament, so the administrative side of the Parliament. And some of you might know us as organizers of the European Youth event, the I, which happens every 2 years in Strasbourg. And as for the association, it's quite a difficult one, but I think I would say that democratic participation is like ice cream. It has so many flavors that everybody can really pick the one which they like. And it's really difficult to find someone who hates ice cream. So I'll go with that.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice and warm introduction. And the association and the ice cream, especially if we look outside and at the cold moment. It's a very nice association to connect with. And I'm very happy that Stuart Fox is with us, a political scientist from the University of Exeter. And as far as I know, you brought research with you to present and also to connect it to the topic we have for today.
Hi, yeah.
Thanks for being here, and it's your floor.
Not at all. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen. Like all academics, I'm afraid I'm going to revert to type. I'm going to hide behind my PowerPoint presentation, but I do genuinely think it's the best way of communicating this. So, can you see that? Okay, Elizabeth, as the slides come through. Fantastic. All right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a real pleasure to be able to talk about the importance of youth participation and volunteering with the European Parliament elections on the horizon, and a particular privilege for me to talk to you about some of the research that I've done in this area. I would going to talk about the kind of work that I've been doing, which shows the potential for volunteering and participation in youth volunteering schemes, I'm sorry, to help encourage young people to vote in elections, particularly those from poorer backgrounds, and reduce the inequalities that we see in who votes and therefore who is listened to. But I do want to kick off by dropping in my own creative association here, which is about democratic participation, which I see as a toolkit. And many of the things that we're talking about today are a part of that toolkit, a part of the range of options that people have open to them to express their political beliefs and opinions and values and try to influence what's going on around them. And although I am going to be talking at length about voting, I wouldn't want anyone to get the impression that I am dismissing the importance of non-electoral political activity. And I think it is something that we ought to be paying more attention to. As I've mentioned, I believe democratic participation to be a toolkit, and in it you find all sorts of different tools which people use depending on their beliefs, but also the target, the political entity that they are trying to influence. We've seen people protesting against energy companies, extracting fossil fuels to try and aid the fight against climate change. We see people using consumer boycotts to try and influence the behavior and the production and employment practices of corporations. And yes, we see people voting primarily with the intention of influencing the policies and the personnel of their governments. And today's Europeans employ a wide range of tools to make their voices heard. And some of them, such as protest, are becoming more common and more widespread. And that's not limited to young people, by the way. Protest is becoming more common amongst people of all ages. But when it comes to voting, the number of young people, and particularly those from the poorest communities and households who are using this vital tool for influencing government, is considerably lower than that of older people. And in some European countries, that gap is widening. Youth turnout is falling further. And that's why this question about the potential for volunteering to help close that gap is so important. I'm just illustrating what I'm talking about briefly here. The graph on the left there is turnout in the European Parliament elections, which we can see has fallen pretty steadily since 1979. But then there was a really encouraging increase in the last set of elections. And if you look at the graph on the right, which only shows data from 2004, we see it's the youngest age groups that are the least likely to vote. They are underrepresented relative to older voters. And this isn't just European Parliament elections. This is happening at virtually all kinds of elections throughout Europe to various degrees. And I've put data from the UK on here. We are still in Europe, despite the wishes of probably too many in my country that it was not the case. When we look at the UK compared with other European countries, the trend is the same, but the UK is actually quite an extreme case. Here, looking at data going back as far as the 1970s, we see that successive generations of citizens have become less likely to vote in elections, and they're developing a persistent habit of being unlikely to vote relative to their elders. Now, sometimes when I have discussions about this trend and about this research, a perfectly reasonable question is asked, which is, why is this a problem? If we know that people are becoming more likely to do things like protest, volunteer, sign petitions, is it a problem that turnout is falling? Can't those other activities compensate? And for me, the answer to that is a definitive no, that is a misguided line of thinking, I think. First of all, the numbers of people who are protesting, for instance, are still far behind the numbers who are voting. It's not a one-for-one replacement that we're seeing a switch away from voting towards protesting. On top of that, when we have a persistent underrepresentation of young people at the ballot box, and again, especially the poorest young people, we have an underrepresentation of young people and their priorities in public debate and in the political process. What's also important is that voting is habitual. It's a habit that we form. If you vote in the first 2 or 3 elections in which you are eligible to vote, there is around a 90% chance that you will vote for every other election that you encounter for the rest of your life. But equally, if you don't vote in those first few elections, there's a similarly high likelihood that you're going to be a lifelong abstainer. So what's also concerning about these trends is that today's young non-voters are very likely to be non-voters tomorrow. And the age and the wealth gaps that we see in who is voting and who has the greatest influence over who forms our governments is going to persist and possibly even widen. So against that backdrop, the question that we have today, can youth volunteering schemes help engage children and young people with elections, is particularly important. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware there's actually been quite a lot of research that looks at the effect of volunteering on various forms of political activity, including voting. And that research almost universally finds that people who volunteer are more likely to vote than people who don't volunteer. What we are, as academics, increasingly becoming aware of, however, is that much of that research exaggerates the beneficial effects of volunteering. We know that most children who volunteer vote in adulthood, but is that because they volunteered, or is it because they've been raised in a way that makes them likely to volunteer when they are children and vote when they are adults? There may be some politicizing events during childhood, such as a really good political school curriculum, for instance, that makes children likely to volunteer to express their political agenda, and then when they're old enough to vote. Alternatively, you might be raised in a household of wealthier, politically active parents who will encourage you to vote when you're a child, volunteer, when you're a child, and to vote when you reach adulthood. And if we don't account for these things, we have a possibility that actually volunteering doesn't affect voting at all, that they are both the product of being raised to be politically active. And it's getting around that conundrum that my research has attempted to do and gives us a fresh look at the effect that volunteering has on voter turnout. Now, there aren't many surveys or any other forms of data in the world, in fact, that would enable us to do this. But we are very lucky in the UK in that there is one survey of households, which is run every year, which collects data from every member in the household, the parents, the children, the grandparents, if they're all in there. And the children that are interviewed are as young as 10. And they're asked about things like, how interested are you in politics? Have you ever gone on a protest? And have you volunteered? And what that enables us to do is to have a look at a group of people before they voted, when they were very young, have a look at how interested in politics they were, a few years later to have a look whether they volunteered, and then when they're old enough to have a look at their voting in a general election, and while accounting for how interested they were during those childhood years in politics and the political engagement of their parents. I am not going to bore you with the details of the entire study. I'm simply going to present to you the key figures that have emerged from that. One of the key questions in this survey was, how likely are you to vote in the next general election? On a scale from 0, meaning you're not going to vote, to 10, meaning you are certain that you are going to vote. And we looked at how likely were children who had volunteered to vote in their first general election, depending on whether they'd volunteered. We divided them as well, depending on whether they were raised by wealthier, politically engaged parents or poorer, politically disengaged parents. If they volunteered the year before the election, what we find is that those raised by wealthier, politically active parents increased their self-reported likelihood of voting by a small amount, 0.24. But for those from poorer backgrounds, the effect was considerably stronger, 1.24 point increase in self-reported vote likelihood, a much higher likelihood of these people voting in the election. So this is great news. Youth volunteering does increase the likelihood of young adults voting in their first elections. And better yet, it gives the greatest benefit to those who are from the poorest backgrounds, who are by far the least likely to vote if they hadn't volunteered. So this is great news. Youth volunteering can increase voter turnout, and it can reduce the inequalities between young people from poorer communities and wealthier communities. There are a couple of challenges that we do need to bear in mind and that I would love to hear any of your thoughts about today. The first one is that most young people who volunteer come from wealthier backgrounds. That's something that in Europe, the UK, the US, we've spent millions and years trying to fix. And progress has been made, but still not enough. So your typical volunteer still comes from a wealthier background and is likely to have politically engaged parents. In the UK, it's about 1 in 4 young adults who volunteer that come from what we would call a poorer background or a politically disengaged household. The ones who have the most to gain from volunteering, therefore, are still quite unlikely to actually volunteer. And then there's another element to this, which was a completely unexpected finding that emerged from the data, which is that there's a gender gap in the benefits of volunteering. Volunteering, for reasons we still don't fully understand, helps young men vote a lot more than young women. Here I'm showing you the same figures, the effect of volunteering on that same self-reported vote likelihood, divided by whether the guys came from wealthier, politically engaged parents or a poorer background. We see that the effect for men is considerably larger than the effect for young women, several times larger, in fact. There is still our benefit for young women, particularly those from poorer backgrounds, but it's much smaller than that for young men. So, can volunteering, the focus of our discussion today, can it help amplify the youth voice in the 2024 European Parliament elections? I think this is good news. Yes, it can. The best data we've got so far says yes, it can. If we can get children and young adults to volunteer, particularly those from the poorest communities, we are going to help equip them to use the tool of voting to express their voice when those elections come around next summer. But we don't want to lose sight of the challenges to this, the downsides that we as a community of people who are passionate about volunteering and passionate about the youth voice in politics need to bear in mind. Most people who volunteer are already likely to vote. We need to get even better at getting children from poorer backgrounds volunteering if we're really going to realise the potential of volunteering to reduce these long-standing age inequalities in turnout. We know that the benefit of volunteering is almost non-existent for young women. We still don't understand why, but we can't ignore this. This is something that nobody has yet acknowledged about volunteering. It may well be contributing to the gender gap in who votes in European Parliament elections, something that I know the Parliament takes very seriously, and therefore we have to bear this in mind. And then finally, we still know nothing about which forms of volunteering provide the greatest benefit. I've not mentioned the forms of volunteering that people have engaged in once during this discussion so far, because we don't know anything about it. None of the surveys that we need collect the data about the types of volunteering that provide the greatest benefit. And that's why we need input from people who are in this call today, who have volunteered and who have got these valuable experiences and research to share with us, as well as we need to get hold of some better data ourselves. Which forms of volunteering provide the benefit, and can they help us address this gender gap in the benefits of volunteering? Thank you all very much for listening. If you'd like to find out more, there's plenty of ways of doing so. And of course, you can ask me questions later on. But thank you once again for having me, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very interesting outcomes and results and connections you presented to us. May I also connect to that and your offer? Please feel invited to ask questions, to comment on the information and on the discussions. You can do so either directly in the chat or use a Mentimeter prepared if you rather want to ask questions in an anonymous way. The link is in the chat too. So whenever you feel like there is an interesting comment you want to share, or a question that could be asked to one of our guests or to all of them connected to the topic of today, please put it in the chat, and feel free to do that anytime. Thanks again for this very interesting start and the findings. And I think it connects quite well to our second small input today from Christiana Xenofontos, for the Vice President of the European Youth Forum. Thanks for being with us today. And I'm pretty sure the information you have and also the small input you can give connects to the findings and to the situation that volunteering and young people Stuart Fox was mentioning before. Thanks for being with us. And if you have an association to share, you are warmly welcome too, of course.
Thank you, first of all, for having me and inviting me here today. I do have also a creative association for democratic participation, for volunteering, but also solidarity. I think it can be like the keys of a piano, because some of them are louder, some of them are softer, but each one plays a crucial role in composing, let's say, the symphony of the civic engagement at the end of the day. And together they play, when they play together, we have these diverse keys create a beautiful melody of unity. So yes, that's from my side, the Creative Association. And indeed, what I will share as well, it's quite connected to Stuart, without even being coordinated. So my name is Christiana Xenofontos, and I am the Vice President of the European Youth Forum, which is the largest democratic platform of youth organizations globally. The Youth Forum represents over 5,000 of youth organizations and millions of young people, driving forward for a focus at EU, Council of Europe, and EU and UN level on youth rights and participation. Once again, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be part of today's webinar and to bring the youth voices into this conversation. I'm also particularly heartened by the title of today's webinar, because the upcoming European elections are an important priority for our organization, also because it is the next big EU process on the horizon. And with it carries an expectation that us as young people, we should be engaged, with many decision makers also being interested in this youth vote. And indeed, there is always such an interest in harnessing the youth vote ahead of every election. But of course, you cannot force young people or any other age group to vote unless you give them something to vote for. And during the latest Eurobarometer survey, which shows that the desire to change things is more of a priority for young respondents when compared to the general population. So therefore, the level of ambition from our politicians needs to be high. So here I would like to provide you also with some kind of background numbers. Because there were significant increases in the youth turnout back in 2019, the European Parliament elections, compared to the previous elections back in 2014. So we had 12 percentage points increase for voters of ages between 25 to 39, and 14 percentage points increase for the ones under 25. But as we heard very correctly previously, young people's turnout is still lower than the general population. And this is a trend that can be observed, unfortunately, globally. Most recently, for young voters, the intention to vote remains lower than other generations. We have a 55% versus a 67%, according to the spring Eurobarometer survey. But however, the line that young people, we are not politically engaged is not correct. Youth activism levels are very high, with many young people getting involved in mass protest, in Occupy movements, in political engagement, also via social media. And we have this high number of 61% of young people in the EU that are involved in some sort of a youth club, and many millions are members of youth organizations, also the ones that they are part of our membership as a European Youth Forum, and we see them daily to be active in their communities in order to try to drive for a change. As young people, we can also be seen at the foreground of major protest movements, notably, of course, the Fridays for Future. And the question here is, how can politicians harness this activism and translate it into an active vote? A lot of this comes down to giving to young people something, as I've mentioned previously, to vote for. And if as young people, we do not see our concerns addressed and our ideas being reflected in the political programs, then why should we even consider voting as a core way to make our voices to be heard? At the European Youth Forum, we have therefore drawn up our youth manifesto in collaboration with our membership, and we have been working for over a year now to socialize it with the European political parties. Our youth manifesto, which you can also find it online, contains a list of 20 demands across the pillars of democracy and participation, the youth rights, sustainability, and digitalization, and includes areas such as improving the transition from education to employment, improving young people's working conditions, improving the consideration of young people in legislative decision-making, and many other areas. And this list of 20 demands across the areas that I've mentioned are suggested areas of concrete policy focus that, if implemented, then would lead to a better future for Europe's youth. And I take now the initiative to share with you the EU Youth Test as an example is one of our headline demands, which is a tool that would ensure that every EU law would be reviewed for its impact on young people. Every policy department, for example, in the European Commission would have to consider young people when they are creating a policy. Youth experts also would be consulted, and most crucially, mitigation measures would be proposed and implemented if a negative impact is identified on a group of young people or on young people as a whole. We are also using the momentum as a European Youth Forum, the momentum of the elections, to amplify our campaign to lower the voting age to 16 for all elections. In 2024, we will see many thousands of Belgian and German 16 and 17-year-olds voting in the European elections for their very first time, they will join their peers from Austria, Malta, and Estonia who already vote at least in one election from the age of 16, and Greece, where the voting age is 17. And I hope that this will prompt momentum and discussions in other countries as well on opening up our democracies to younger voters to make their voices count in this institutionalized way. Because at the end of the day, when we are 16 or 17, we can work, we can drive, we can make medical decisions, we can join political parties, we can often get married or enter a civil partnership, but there is no reason why we should not be able to have a democratic saying. And this level of responsibility that dawns on your 16th birthday should match also the democratic rights that we have as young people by lowering the voting age to 16 for all elections in Europe. A further reason for the perceived, I would say, apathy of young people is related directly to the direct representation. We usually don't see many young people in positions of political power. And to be more precise here, 50% of the world's population is under the age of 30, but globally, at the moment, only 2.91% of the world's parliamentarians are under the age of 30. And things, of course, are not better within the European Parliament. Just a few months before the next European elections, we have only 2 members of the European Parliament that are still under the age of 30, which is just the 0.28% of all the MEPs. So we need to have more younger people as candidates on the list of the political parties in a meaningful way, not a tokenistic one. And we need to have more young people being promoted within the political administration so that young people can see themselves directly being represented in the makeup of political power structures. In addition to that, to what I've mentioned earlier on, like addressing young people's demands on political programs, the vote on 16 and young candidates, on a very practical level, it is worth noting, according to the latest also Eurobarometer, a staggering 68% of young people also didn't vote because of practical reasons, not ideological ones, but because they were either on holiday or away from home. And this opens up the discussion for the future elections on steps to take regarding the e-voting or even the postal voting. But for now, it's also highlighting the importance of the development and the availability of resources for the ones, for the first time in young voters to facilitate their registration, but also their participation. And now about volunteering, a critical question we have to ask is if in the current legal framework at a national and a European level, all young people can access and engage in equality volunteering. As we know, in many countries, volunteering and volunteers particularly still lack a solid legal framework that protects their rights and their responsibilities. And in many other contexts as well, volunteering can even lead to a loss of important social rights since it is not recognized by state institutions as an occupation that can lead to the acquisition of important competences for their personal but also professional development. And volunteering also needs to be sustainable for the individual, but also for the organizations that they are providing it. And this means a lot of capacity. Unfortunately, at the moment, volunteering is still reserved for the privileged European youth, those that have the time, the skills, or the resources to invest themselves there. And young people who are in precarious situations will not be able to volunteer. And thus we strongly believe in the need to ensure better conditions for volunteers by protecting their rights and by ensuring access to quality volunteering opportunities. To sum it up, as we are running out of time, I assume I would like to urge us all to first listen to young people, not running into conclusions regarding our participation, because participation can be defined in several other forms, going beyond the voting and including voting, of course, and to try together to work on ways, tools, methods that they can indeed improve and strengthen the youth participation. And this is the only way forward, also for our democracies, in order to be stronger, in order to be more inclusive and more resilient. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. I'm looking forward for the panel and of course, to listen to any thoughts from our audience.
Thank you. Very interesting comments and also results and knowledge that you bring and share with us. Maybe as you already mentioned, I think panel is needed and questions and discussions are open. May I invite all of our 4 guests to our virtual panel. This would be Christiana again and Stuart and our 2 guests from the parliament, Joao, if possible, from the train, and Sophia. So if you could join us, how can, there was this connection to engagement and the possibility to contribute. So how can a better engagement of young people with democracy be supported? What are possible tools or ways to support this need and the possibility and also the quality of engagement?
Our side, really, a lot of things have been said by Stuart and Christiana, a lot of things I've been reflecting on myself. So thank you for bringing a lot of those points. I mean, first of all, obviously, this perception of young people not participating in voting means that they are apathetic and they don't want to participate, which is obviously not true because there's so many ways to participate. And there is indeed a lot of barriers to participation. And especially when we're talking about voting, there is lack of understanding because young people think, okay, I don't know enough about it. There is lack of confidence to express opinions because why would people listen to me? There is lack of relatability, which Christiana has mentioned, because young people look at decision makers and they just don't see that they don't look like them. And I mean, that's honestly not not surprising because, I mean, in addition to some stats which Christiana has mentioned, I think the average age of a world leader is around 60, 62 years old. So I kind of can see where this is coming from. And really the top barrier actually to participation and especially voting is the lack of perceived confidence. And what I think is important is the word perceived, because it's not like suddenly when people turn 16 or 18, they are magically, they know everything and they know how to vote. And it's not like older people know. It's just this confidence which often young people don't have. And that's where I think volunteering and support of engagement from the side of institutions, but also of course on the ground, is so important, because in order to kind of bridge those gaps and those barriers, this support is really needed. So I think what is essential is really helping to build this confidence of young people, and that can be done through providing information, which also I think is important, and providing possibilities to participate and to vote, and especially when it comes to yeah, when it comes to the European elections, it's providing information about why is it important, how, but also how to vote and things like that. What is I think more important is providing the opportunities. And I understand very well that opportunities don't often reach out those who need them the most, because again, access to information or the way how information is presented. But I think different opportunities which are there on different levels and provided by not only institutions, but often also organizations, I mean, members of the European Youth Forum, but also, of course, SALTO, these are essential to kind of help build this confidence, and by that also help increase this political participation. So yeah, I think I leave it at this and happy to discuss more.
I don't know, Christiana, maybe do you have to add on, or do you want to add on this comment from Sophia on and also the topic of lack of possibilities, but also the feeling of the confidence to do so?
I mean, I totally agree, and I think volunteerism is supporting young people to actually build this capacity of feeling confident. But at the same time, I want to bring into our discussion something equally important, which is something that also from my experience, me myself being volunteer, also a youth worker at some point, it's very important that volunteerism manages to build these safe spaces. In order for young people to participate, they need to feel safe. And safe spaces can be provided also via volunteerism. Also being provided are provided from youth workers most of the times. And this is something that our politicians need to understand. I mean, the high level representatives, that participation, as I've mentioned previously, is not just the voting. We shall avoid, remember young people every 5 years when we ask for their vote. We have to build this safe space for young people to feel part of the community, to feel part of the policies that they are implemented on a high level, on a high policy level, so as then come as a natural consequence that they will go and vote. So yeah, I mean, apart from agreeing with Sophia, I wanted also to bring into our discussion the safe spaces as well.
Maybe connected, I think connected to the topic of spaces or safe spaces, maybe that also being in a webinar that is organized by a youth program, and Sophia, you were also referring a bit to the possibility of using programs and different possibilities to take part in activities. In your opinion, or according to your experience, how can Erasmus Plus or European Solidarity Corps programs contribute in promoting youth participation? Can they play a role in this quality of volunteering, and then the maybe the possibility of increasing the level of voting? And I don't know, maybe Stuart, you did the research connected to that. Do you see that these programs can help and can provide those spaces that are maybe needed for young people?
So the short answer is yes. I think they can. I think schemes like that, we have we have examples of schemes like this that effectively provide young people with opportunities to meet new people, learn new skills, have a positive impact for people in their community, and learn about their community, learn about issues that they may not have previously been exposed to. And we know that these things do have a real benefit on how interested people are in what's going on in their community, how knowledgeable they feel about it, and therefore how confident they are in expressing their opinions, and that, for instance, through participating in politics. But I think we have to remember that the majority of people who are participating in such schemes are the ones who are more likely to be voting anyway when they're older, more likely to be already active elsewhere. It's certainly not true for all members of these schemes, but the most likely ones are the ones who are coming from a background, or coming from schools, or coming from families and communities that make them likely to be politically active anyway. And therefore, the capacity of these schemes to address some of the trends in turnout that I talked about and that Christiana talked about is a little limited at the moment, because it's so difficult to broaden the range of young people who are able, who are willing, who are interested in taking part in those schemes, and who can meet the thresholds. For instance, if you're going through university, you have to have achieved certain grades. Children from poorer backgrounds are less likely to have achieved those grades and therefore to be invited to take part in these schemes. So they can absolutely have a positive role, but I think we need to be aware of and have at the forefront of our minds that the ability of such schemes to have that role is to an extent limited by the limited range of young people in socioeconomic terms that are invited to take part in them.
So there was also a question from the audience if then volunteering is considered as a privilege, looking at the background from the people that take part in those activities.
Yeah, I think it is. There's a very critical view of volunteering that's put about in some fields of academia, is that it is an engine of inequality, because it's a means through which the privileged acquire more resources that increase their privilege. I don't know of the extent to which I agree with it entirely, but at the same time, we can't ignore that it does have that potential. It is a privilege, and we've got better at engaging people from underrepresented backgrounds with volunteering in the last 20 years. But despite that, the overwhelming majority of volunteers, whichever country you look in and almost whichever scheme you look at, they're coming from more privileged backgrounds.
Okay. So then maybe connected to that, Sophia and Christiana, there was a question from the audience connected to that. How can we then reach the poorest population when they don't know about the opportunities available to them? So do you have any connect or ideas on that?
I mean, this is $1 million question, which I think comes up very often. And I mean, I will be very honest, there is no magic pill for all. I think that the programs like Erasmus Plus and Solidarity Corps, they are fantastic, and they give opportunities to, of course, a limited group of people. I mean, if it was up to me, everybody would be able to do that, but obviously it's not. So I think we should not forget that, of course, there are limits to those programs. It doesn't mean that they are not good or they shouldn't exist, but it means that we either need to extend or we need to see how we can go with different means to different groups of young people who do not have those opportunities. And I think this is really work on all fronts, and here work on the ground by the communities and the youth organizations on the ground, I think is very important, because from the side of kind of the European level and then those programs, there's only so much we can reach. I think the work of local communities, different organizations focusing on different topics is I think this is kind of the way in, because it's also kind of peer-to-peer. And then this is what I think helps a lot. And I mean, from my own experience, and I also got into Europe through volunteering, and I that's kind of, you see it, people who do that when you're younger, and you kind of try to learn to catch some things from this. I think it's very important, really, this groundwork from the organizations locally. But I think also Christiana has also more experience on this, because I'm sure a lot of the members you have already do that.
I mean, since we are talking about the Erasmus Plus as well, it was just a few days ago that we published also our position paper regarding the future of the Erasmus Plus program. And to be fair also towards the program as such, it has changed the lives of millions young Europeans, and I would say that it transformed them also into active citizens. So we have to, into this position paper that I can share, of course, in the chat, we are highlighting the areas of the Erasmus Plus as a project that they can be improved, and that they can actually be improved in a way that we will indeed have included in the Erasmus Plus the marginalized young people, and not the privileged ones, because the privileged ones, they can reach to the Erasmus, they can reach out to the Erasmus Plus, they can be part of it. So the main goal and the main bet for all of us, meaning including the youth organizations and us as youth representatives, is to reach out also to these marginalized young people. And I think you can find some good elements into this position paper that they can improve also the project as such, we are going a bit beyond the increasing of the total budget. We are creating also some explicit definitions of the groups considered as participants with fewer opportunities in order to facilitate their access to information, targeting, and to monitoring afterwards when it comes to the Erasmus Plus program.
Thank you. I can see that in their chat there's some more questions also connected, or comments connected to this topic of the gap of young people taking part in those activities and being able to do volunteering, and maybe to the connection of voting. Maybe a more general question also raised in the Mentimeter this time. Maybe Sophia, a question, and also Christiana, to you again. How can a young person reach out to policymakers in order to ensure that their ideas are heard and taken into account? So are there measures, possibilities, ways to connect, to reach out? Maybe Christiana, if you want to start this time, and then Sophia to go on.
I can, yes. I mean, I can urge all young people to actually actively participate in youth organizations. But of course, we have to respect the young people that they probably decide not to be involved in youth organizations. And those ones can be, actually, they can make their voices be heard by being part, at least, of projects such as the EU Youth Dialogue, which is the biggest participatory mechanism that we have at the moment on a European level, that a young person can share their views and they can contribute to actually form a policy that affects their lives afterwards. I've mentioned previously the EU Youth Test. By advocating and by lobbying also to their local authorities, to their national, to their governments, to their ministries, to apply and implement the EU Youth Test is a method that they can help young people, also generation after us, in order to secure that every policymaker will understand and will make an effort to reach out to young people before they implement any policy. Yeah, and maybe Sophia can add more to that. Of course, just to urge you all, since I see many participants, there are many ways to contribute into the change of policy making, but feel free also to reach out to me afterwards, or find the European Youth Forum through our social media and via our website, in order to get informed also for upcoming projects that we are having. Also next year, we are having the Level Up. Level Up is going to take place between 12th to 14th of April. It's a safe space for all young people to come and participate, to understand what is participation. And of course, there is a lot of highlight this year to the EP elections. So it's going to be a very nice opportunity. I urge you all to Google it, find about it, reach out to us in order to provide you with more information.
Thank you. I, of course, agree with everything Christiana has said. Thank you for bringing up Level Up, so I don't have to do that. There is really a lot. Maybe I'll focus on kind of the more basic ones, and then also something that we do for this. Of course, you can always reach out to your local representative or to the member of the European Parliament who is from your country or your region, or maybe even from your city. And many of them have offices locally, and many of them are very open to hearing the concerns of the citizens back in their constituencies. So this is always still a possibility. I also saw Joanna mentioned in the chat that there is European Citizens Initiative, which is, of course, it's quite a complex process, but if you have an idea or you can support ideas which are already there, which is a possibility. In addition to joining the youth organizations, I think we also can see drivers for change in movements, like already has been mentioned, the Fridays for Future. Like these things, obviously, it's not that it's one person who kind of goals. It tells the member that they're concerns, but when there's big topics like that and there is a big mobilization, this is also what change policy and what makes decisions happen and implemented by policymakers. From our side, for example, and as the European Parliament and the European Youth Event especially, we are always trying to collect concerns and ideas of young people and then pass them on to the policymakers. So, for example, at the every I and in the process before it, we collect ideas from young people. So this time it has been done online through the Youth Ideas .eu platform. And this is really where anybody can write their ideas, what they want. And then those ideas, you can also contribute to those ideas during the event, but it's open to people who are not only those who are participating to the I. And then we analyze and collect those ideas. And for example, after the last I, we collected the 15 kind of the most popular ideas during the event. And then quite recently, I think a month and a half or 2 months ago by now, those ideas have been presented to the policymakers. We had the youth hearing organized in the parliament with the president of the European Parliament and almost 15 members who were directly reacting to those ideas. And really, these were clear ideas from young people on certain topics, and the members were reacting and saying how they can contribute to the policy. So this is really very direct way to do that, and this is something we've been doing for every I and we'll be doing obviously for the I 2025. We have also been doing it with the process of the conference on the future of Europe, which was already maybe 2 years ago by now, where we were presenting youth ideas to the conference as well. So from our side, we tried to kind of channel those ideas which we collect through our events to the members of the European Parliament.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for answering the possibility of contribution and also this participation topic. We have some questions connected to figures. There is one in the chat, and Stuart, I kind of look at you. I will put another question in the chat because it's connected to figures and numbers again, so it's easier to read from the Mentimeter. And there is another question in the chat already a bit connected to that. So the global variation in voter turnout between individuals from lower income, and again the connection, how do you how is this connected, the low income reality and the topic of privilege, and maybe also this other question I asked, I put in the chat right now, the turnout in the EU election being very different from one country to another. I don't know if you have any more information or for us to share connected to those questions.
I do. I'll take them in reverse order. So the short answer here is that yes, the turnout in EU elections differs quite substantially from one EU member state to another. The figures for young people tend to follow the same pattern. So in Belgium, for instance, overall turnout is very high. Youth turnout is very high in Belgium as well. In the UK, before we left the European Union, turnout was relatively very low in European Parliament elections. Youth turnout was also very low. And in virtually all countries, you see a gap between older voters and younger voters in terms of turnout in European Parliament elections and national elections. But the size of that gap does differ somewhat. It's bigger in the UK than most other countries. It's smaller in Belgium. It's almost non-existent in Belgium than many other countries as well. But the broad pattern's the same. You don't have a situation where overall turnout is very low in one country, but youth turnout happens to be very high there. It tends to follow the same national structure. The previous related question was whether there's global variation in the turnout divide between younger people from poorer and wealthier backgrounds. And again, yes, there is, but these divides aren't that well understood. It's actually surprisingly difficult to get the data that we need to understand them. The most common tool for studying voter turnout is surveys. That's what all the data that we talked about here has come from, almost all of it today. Surveys aren't always the best tool when you want to study small subgroups of a population unless you have an enormous research budget. It's not easy to get large samples of young people from poor backgrounds to complete surveys, for instance. So we don't understand these gaps all that well. Some of the factors, though, that we are almost certain are related include the national political structure, if you like. So I mentioned before, we've got the UK, where the gap between older people and younger people is, relatively speaking, very wide. And we've got Belgium, where that gap is much smaller. One of the most important reasons for that is that in Belgium, voting is compulsory. In the UK, it's not. Another factor that explains these things is electoral systems. The UK is somewhat unusual for having a majoritarian or first past the post electoral system, which, among other things, creates safe seats all over the country, constituencies that are very unlikely to change hands from one party to another because there are just so many supporters of one particular party who live there, who are prepared to vote for that candidate. So if you happen to support someone else, your vote is effectively wasted. We have quite a lot of these constituencies in the UK, and that discourages people from voting, young and old alike, but it does discourage people from voting. Countries that use proportional representation don't have these safe seats, not to anything like the same extent anyway. And so more people, again, of any age, feel that their vote is likely to have an effect. Other factors that we think play a role include political education. Countries that have got a good political education system tend to be better at getting young people to vote in general, and there is some evidence emerging that the gap between wealthier and poorer young people in turnout is smaller in those countries as well. And then other than that, it's all very speculative because we just don't know enough about these divides at this point. It's something we hope to learn more about in the future now that we know just how important this gap is, but it's very difficult to understand it all in its entirety at this point.
Thank you.
If I may, sorry,
Go on.
just to compliment on a few things, because this is indeed a very good question, but it varies because of the different national contexts. For example, in the previous European elections, we had the highest turnout of young people back in 2019. But from the country that I'm coming from, Cyprus, we had the lowest turnout. And this is because of several reasons. I mean, among other things, also Stuart already mentioned, is of course the civil education. And when I've mentioned previously the vote at 16, for us is not just lowering the voting age, but is building the ground until you go and change the legislation. So as young people are voting from the age of 16, so you provide them first with the civil education to understand in which political system they are living, why is it important to participate, what is the importance of their vote, of their voting rights. But there are also other elements that they make the lives of young people very hard in order to participate in an electoral process. For example, the registration process. There are still countries that is not happening automatically. You have to go and register yourself, and most of the times, not even online is available. This thing, you have to go and follow a very bureaucratic process. And then again, it's expected from us to also go and vote again. And there are still countries that they don't have the e-voting, neither nor the postal voting. So I think it's a combination of things that make also the voting process quite difficult or challenging. And that's why we are asking for our democracies to become more inclusive, more participatory, in a way that it will build, let's say, the ground until the day of the voting. And it will provide not just the young people, but all citizens with tools that they can make indeed the democracy more inclusive and more participatory.
If I may add, because I think it's very important what Christiana is saying, that you already mentioned it before as well, it's kind of this building the relationship between election and election, because we can't just expect that suddenly young people are going to go vote because we have not done civic education. We never talk to them between. So I think this process and then giving civic education, providing civic education and engaging, and then it will be very natural that they go to vote. So this really building the relationship between political engagement and young people is essential. I just wanted to stress this again.
Thanks for that. And the reality, as Stuart and Christiana, you were both mentioning, is very different in a national context, and the possibilities and the challenges that young people face. Maybe it was mentioning also by you, Stuart, and Christiana in your short input at the beginning, and maybe a connection to that to you, Sophia. It was mentioning there is, of course, other forms of participation besides voting, or in addition to elections and voting, which is protests, petitions, manifests. Fridays for Future was mentioned. So those different activities. How are those forms considered when making decisions in your work? Do they influence, or is this part of the contribution that is seen, or how would this be connected when we talk about participation from young people?
Yes, I mean, from our side, absolutely. I think they are not least important because participation. I mean, voting is only one thing, and we do see that political participation parties, and voting among young people is lower than actual participation. So it's not like they don't go; they just find different ways, and it's not only kind of this more classical ways of signing petitions or going on the streets and protesting. It also things like picking the clothes you buy based on the sustainability of the producer, for example. So those things which really affect a lot generally, not only the political landscape, but generally how the world operates a bit. So I think young people are very aware of those things, and we just need to not forget also to look at those, because if there is a boycott of a certain product, it should affect also the how the political decisions are made. And I think, especially with big protests, they absolutely affect the political decisions, or at least they should, in my opinion, because I think with Fridays for Future, which has already been mentioned, we can see the raise the interest on of climate topics and in generally climate agenda, and that was a push which came from young people. So of course this kind of is the easiest example to use, but I'm sure that there is more, and that shows that the voice matters, and we do need to look at those different ways young people engage to create political decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely with that one. I think something that academics, including myself, have at various times been guilty of is paying a bit too much attention to voting and not enough to the non-electoral political activities, such as protesting and petitioning and so on. Voting has a distinctive, unique constitutional function, which is not replicated by any other form of political participation, and that makes it important in its own right. I don't think there's anything wrong with recognizing that, and therefore the consequences of not voting are in some ways distinct from the consequences of not protesting, not petitioning. There's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore these other forms of political participation. They are becoming more important. As I mentioned in my introduction earlier, actually, this is not just a youth thing. Everybody is becoming more likely to protest and to sign petitions and to boycott now. This is part of a wider evolution of what it means to be a democratic citizen, which is apparent amongst people of all ages. And you can't ignore them. And you also can't conclude that somebody is politically disengaged just because they're not voting, because they might be doing these other things. In fact, many people are doing these other things. But there's another reason I think we need to bear them in mind, which is I've mentioned and others have mentioned that there is this socioeconomic divide between wealthier and poorer people in turnout, which is really important and that volunteering can help address. From what we know about protesting, petitioning, boycotting, that socioeconomic divide is even wider than it is for voting. Some gaps are much smaller. The gender gap, for instance, for protesting or for boycotting is non-existent, whereas for voting in some countries, it's still very much there. But when it comes to the differences between, say, having a degree and not having a degree, or coming from a wealthier household and not coming from a wealthier household, the differences in who is likely to go on a protest, to sign a petition, to take part in a consumer boycott is often wider than is the case for voting. And that, therefore, is another reason we can't lose sight of these things, because it's absolutely the case that some young people are embracing many non-electoral techniques for expressing their political voice. These things are becoming more common. They cannot be ignored. But there are a minority who, as well as not voting, they're not doing many of the other things either. The inequalities that lead to low turnout amongst young people from poorer background, the structural factors that we as democratic societies have not been effective enough at overcoming, these affect non-electoral political participation as well, and we mustn't lose sight of that. So I completely agree. It's very important. You can't talk about democratic citizenship without talking about these things, for both good and bad sides.
Thanks for this addition. And yeah, when you talk about youth participation, it covers quite a big range of different activities and looking at different layers and levels of inclusion. Thanks for that. Looking at the time, and thanks for this very interesting discussion, maybe to round up, looking at this topic of volunteering, participation, and the connection to the elections and the possibility for young people to take part in decisions. There was one question also in the Menti, and then maybe it's nice to round it up with this question: what are the potential long-term benefits of encouraging youth engagement through volunteering? Also looking at the political landscape. So why do we do it? So maybe this would be a big one, but an opportunity for rounding up this panel. And maybe Christiana, do you want to start?
Yes, I can start. I would like also to mention a few things about participation, which it comes in many layers, as you've mentioned, but also in many forms, several forms, including protesting that I've mentioned also previously. But there's also this huge amount of work coming from the youth organizations that they are providing young people with opportunities of participation, and they are actually contributing into the strengthening of what we are mentioned as participation. And nowadays, we've seen that participation is becoming more and more affiliated to what we call transparency. Young people, they are not only interested into participation, they demand from their representatives to actually be transparent. They demand to understand what is their work when it comes to policy reforms, to policy implementation. So this is also something very interesting and very important also to highlight. Now, when it comes, what was the last question? Sorry, Elizabeth.
What is the long-term benefit?
The long-term benefit. I mean,
and can I ask you for a short answer, please?
Yes, apart from making our societies more democratic and stronger, I think that it's also a part of our, as human beings, as political creatures as well. It's part of our daily lives to have opinion on things. And it's important to build this opinion based on facts, on arguments. And by participating, I mean, we can create better democracy, stronger, especially nowadays with whatever is happening around us, the devastated scenery that we see around us. I think it's something that we have to consider as a way, the participation, to actually go back to our values, our core values when we are talking about democracy. That is, of course, affiliated to participation.
Thank you. Sophia?
Not much to add, to be honest, but I would stress again that it's really just strengthens democracy, because it's such a big and important group of population that we can't really, like, what kind of democracy will we have if we ignore participation and opinions of a big group of that democracy? So I think it just kind of goes without saying that it's just essential, and without that we wouldn't have the democracy we're striving for.
Thank you. And Stuart?
Yeah, I agree entirely. It's all about improving democracy, strengthening democracy. And for me, the particular benefit of that is that volunteering has the potential to reduce this incredibly stubborn gap between people who vote from poorer backgrounds and wealthier backgrounds. And I keep coming back to it because we've never found a solution to it. Volunteering can help us address that, and it can help us address the long gap in voter turnout and other forms of political participation between young and old. And I come from a country where we can see the consequences of these differences really starkly. You know, Brexit was supported by more than 3/4 of people over the age of 65. It was opposed by more than 3/4 of people under the age of 25. It wasn't just differences in turnout that explained why the UK voted to leave the European Union. It was much more complex than that. But younger people were underrepresented in that. Their turnout was lower. Their turnout in the elections was lower. If we can reduce those gaps, we can have democratic decisions that are taken on a more inclusive basis. We won't always be happy with them. That's democracy. But our democracies will be better if we can get rid of these glaring omissions in who gets to say what goes on.
Thank you. Thanks for these strong words at the end, and the very interesting and diverse discussions tackling a lot of different topics connected to participation and young people and volunteering. Thanks for your time and being with us. Now, thanks everybody for the questions and the contributions. There's a lot of interesting things in the chat to continue the discussion with, to find more information, to connect, to participate, also for the next days. To round up, as you can already see, there will be a conference next year connected to these topics, where all those different topics from these webinars will be again discussed and connected with. So feel free to find some more information and to stay tuned to it. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for sharing, for contributing, for asking questions, for giving us all this information and the different point of views. See you hopefully at another conference, at another webinar connected to volunteering. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.